So let's try a couple examples and kind of see what we're looking at. Before we can look at a couple examples, though, let's talk about one more thing. We talked about whether or not something is a function a second ago, and we said something is not a function if you see something like the following. We said -3, 0 and -3, 2 meant you did not want this happening. You did not want your x's repeating. Well, notice if you don't want your x's repeating, so no x's repeating, well, remember that if x's repeat, it means you'll end up with 2 points on top of one another, which means you don't want any points on top of one another. You don't want any vertical lines to hit your graph more than once. So that's why they came up with something called the vertical line test. It says if a vertical line hits your graph once or not at all, it's a function. If you have even one vertical line that hits more than once, then what does that mean? It means you've got repeating x's and it won't be a function. So the vertical line test is meant to tell us whether or not something is a function. So notice this first one, if I draw any vertical line, I'm going to hit at most 1 point. So that means yes, it is a function because I'm going to only hit the graph at most once. However, if I look at the next one, the circle, I can draw several vertical lines where I'll hit it more than once. I'll hit it twice. And that's why it is not a function, because I can hit a vertical line, any vertical line, more than once. Notice the third graph we have is even worse. It can actually hit a vertical line not once, not twice, but 3 times. So again, that is not a function because you have at least one vertical line hitting at least more than once. Actually, 3 times. And let's look at this last one, the U shape. Well, notice with the U shape, it's actually pretty amazing, but the vertical lines will only hit it once. So is it a function? Absolutely. The vertical lines only hit it once. So that is our vertical line test. Again, as a summary, what that's looking for is to see whether or not something is a function. And it does that by seeing if a vertical line hits your graph more than once. If it hits your graph more than once, it's not a function. If it doesn't, it is. The other way to look at this is to look for whether or not you have repeating x's. That does the same thing as well. So in this first example, let's first start by determining whether or not it's a function. Remember, the vertical line test tells us we're only worried about the x's. So let's look at the x's. 8, 5, 9, and 3. So what this means is because the x's do not repeat, that this will indeed be a function. So yes, it is a function, but it's because the x's do not repeat. Because the x's do not repeat, it will pass the vertical line test. And I always end up shortening the vertical line test to VLT because it just is a pain to write. Now let's talk about the other piece of the puzzle. Now they want us to talk about the domain and the range. Okay, well, let's talk about the domain first. Then we'll talk about the range second. Okay, well, domain means we should be only looking at the x values. Well, in order to understand what I'm looking at here is I kind of have to have a visual of what kind of graph this is. Well, this graph, it's in set notation, is just a bunch of isolated, well, they're x's and y's. So they're just points. So it's something very similar to this first picture up here where we just have a bunch of points. So that's what I should be listing, is just a bunch of x values. I don't want to say that my x values range using interval notation from, let's say, 3 to 9. The problem is that when they include things like 3.5 and 3.2, I only want to include the numbers 3, 5, 9, and 8. And to do that, the only way to do that is to use those set braces, where I'm just going to list a few specific points or values. You don't have to do it in order, but I do think it's a good idea to get in the habit. So we have 3, 5, 8, and 9. That are all your possible x values. And again, we're going to use these set braces because we're just talking about a few isolated values. We don't want to include every possibility in between them, just these values. Now let's look at the range. The range, we want to look at the y values. 0, 4, 3, and 8. But it's going to work the exact same way. I want to only list a couple y values. I don't want to include every possibility in between them. So I'm going to use the set braces again. And I am going to put them in order even though you don't have to. So we have the possibilities for y values of 0, 3, 4, and 8 only are the only y values we see. Okay, so that's it. It is a function. There's our domain and our range, and we see our set braces. Let's take a look at the last one here, at b. So let's determine whether or not it's a function first by looking at the x values, and what do we notice? On the first and the last point, we have a repeating x value. What this means is no, this is not a function. Because the x values repeat, it will not pass the vertical line test. So it will not pass the vertical line test. However, we still would like to find the domain and the range. So let's start out with the domain, which means starting to look at those x values. So again, we have something similar to the last one, where we're just looking at a couple isolated points. So whatever our domain is it's going to go inside of braces. Well, what are the only x values we see? Well, we see the x value of -3 and an x value of 9. Once the 9 is in your list, you're done. You don't need to write it twice. And those are the only two possibilities in your list for x values, either -3 or +9. Now let's look at the range. The range should be found by looking at the y values. Now we've got -2, 5, and 2. And again, these are still just isolated points, so we're going to use our braces. So we'll start out with a -2. Then we had a +2 and a +5, and those are the only y values we see, and those are the only y values we are giving as an option by using the set braces. Nothing else will be included because those are the only points we have on our picture.